Hello, class, and welcome to Lecture 2, Part 1, on your lesson for story structure. And in Part 1, we're going to talk about narrative form. And here in our first slide, we have a still from Lady Bird, your movie for the lesson, which you are going to analyze in terms of its story structure. Okay, storytelling. Because storytelling is so common, it's literally everywhere, and so powerful, we need to take a close look at how films embody narrative form. It's important for us to understand how storytelling works, how it operates on us, how it influences us, right? How it moves us. Not only so that we can understand those things, but also so we can learn how to make story ourselves. Because I know a number of you would love to be storytellers, would love to write for TV or the movies, or write novels, or write graphic novels. And so the first step in being able to do that is to understand how story works. So what is narrative form? Narrative form simply is the structure. We talked about how form is essentially structure in the last lecture, through which movies tell stories. Same as a house needs a blueprint, a structure, design structure, so that when you build it, it stands up and holds together and does what you want, doesn't fall apart. So does a story need a narrative structure. And when we talk about going to the movies, we almost always mean that we're going to see a narrative film, a film that tells a story. And as we discussed before, narrative films that tell stories, are the kind of stories that we're going to discuss and learn about in this course. And they do have many different embodiments: movies, television, short films, plays, novels, graphic novels, comic books. The list goes on. Toy Story 4 is as much a narrative story as a film that's not animated. The animation doesn't make it not narrative. So we talked about the structure of a house and how the blueprints are designed ahead of time so that the house doesn't fall down, so that it does what you want. We can think about our screenplay, our script, as a blueprint for our story. Because narrative films, like houses, like buildings, are so complex. They are almost always written out first in screenplay format. People don't just show up and start making stuff up, right? It would almost never hold together. And besides, film and television is way too expensive to waste that kind of time. So it's important that when everybody shows up to do their job on set, that they know exactly the story they're telling. Actors know their lines. Now, it doesn't mean there's not going to be improvisation on set, that things aren't going to change, because stories are always evolving. And we can't always see or understand their final form until we've worked through them a little bit. So the screenplay is the blueprint that guides all the collaborators in the filmmaking process: the actors, the cinematographers, the editors, the set designers, the costume designers. Before anything else, we have to have a screenplay. So you fledgling filmmakers need to know that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about expectations. Because as viewers, as consumers of all these stories, we approach narrative film with certain expectations. We may have read the book, for example, Harry Potter, or a graphic novel. We're talking about Watchmen, seen the original film to a sequel or a remake. Seems like almost everything is a sequel and a remake these days, right? So if you're seeing a Spider-Man film, you're definitely bringing expectations about who Spider-Man is and what he's going to do in the movie. We may have seen the trailer, which has set up expectations, followed the production online, right? It seems like these films and shows get announced a couple of years out now so that we can follow every detail and excitement can be generated, right? Or we've simply seen films in the same genre. So if we see a spy film, for example, we know that a spy film is going to have certain elements that are going to repeat. So it's important to understand that we all bring expectations. It's important to understand this as a viewer, and it's important to understand this as a writer, so that you can both conform to those expectations, give people what they expect, but also subvert them. Give people what they don't expect, because people also, consumers of story, also really enjoy being surprised and given something new. And related to that, there are assumptions that we all bring, right? We are able to make sense of movies because we have consumed thousands of previous movies, right? And so when we sit down in our seat or we pick up our book, we assume there's going to be basic story structure elements, like characters that do things, right? Incidents that are connected in a series of cause and effects. Conflict and resolution, in other words, the characters are going to fight for something that's important to them. There's going to be some kind of resolution at the end where the conflict is decided. And there's going to be emotion and meaning, right? There's going to be some kind of theme that's trying to say something, that's trying to move us in some way. So at the very basic level of storytelling, these expectations and assumptions are very important. So now we're getting a little bit more into your reading from the Bordwell and Thompson article from their textbook. And again, we don't want to take for granted that and jump ahead steps. We want to make sure that we understand the basics of storytelling and story structure before we move on. So, at the very basic, a story takes place in time and space, right? We all know that. A narrative is an account of a string of events occurring in space and time. They have to be set somewhere, right? Even if they're set in a void, that void is still a somewhere, a place, right? A receptacle for the action that's unfolding. And then time. What year is the movie set? What season is it set in? Is it a Christmas movie? Is it a war movie that takes place over a period of several years, and so on? And narratives do not unfold randomly, but rather is an ordered series of events connected by the logic of cause and effect. As I said, something happens and there's a reaction. Something happens and there's a consequence. Characters have to deal with the consequences, right? And the logic of this cause and effect, this one thing after another pattern that we see in all stories, ties together basic story elements, such as character traits, goals, obstacles, and actions. We'll talk about those in more detail as we go through the rest of the lesson. So, probably the most important element of storytelling, at least is the way that we understand it, is character desire. Right? Characters have to want something, otherwise there's no plot. And so if you haven't thought about this before, next time you watch something, every time you watch something, just try to pick out the character's desire. What do they want? Is it love? Is it revenge? Is it a decent cup of coffee, right? Is it a combination of things? And it's their desire that sets the cause and effect chain of events into motion. Narrative films focus on human or human-esque characters and their struggles. Character desire is typically responsible for cause and effect. What do I mean by human-esque? Well, robots, right? Aliens, animals that talk, animated characters, right? They're all basically human for the most part. They just take different forms so we can tell different kinds of stories. So, the next really important element of story, if you have a character that has a goal or a desire, you're not going to have a story unless their pursuit of that goal encounters some resistance, right? somebody's or something is trying to stop them. Characters encounter obstacles in pursuing their goals, right? The collision of goals and obstacles creates the conflict and thus the drama. And again, this is true for everything that you watch. So as you watch films in this course, and as you watch film, television, or read or play video games, recognize the goal and obstacle format that fuels all storytelling. So what kinds of obstacles are we talking about? Well, there's as many obstacles as there are kinds of stories out there, right? Obstacles can be anything. They can be other characters who are standing in the way of what your protagonist wants to achieve. Non-humans, they can be aliens, they could be monsters, they could be nature, right? It could be an earthquake, hurricane. Think of a movie like Castaway, right? Tom Hanks marooned on a desert island. The obstacles are the sea that's preventing him from getting home. Obstacles may come in the form of concrete physical challenges. Somebody who wants to fight our main character. The actions and desires of others. There might be a love triangle. Two characters are competing for the desire of a third character. Or psychological and emotional issues. Trauma, addiction, disease, excuse me, heartbreak, right? All of these things are obstacles that impede our protagonists achieving their desire. And most narrative films, especially today, because movies are so, and television storytelling is so sophisticated and complex, and viewers, we all have become such sophisticated viewers that we demand a more complex storytelling. And you need to consider this as a writer too. And so we have characters that are overcoming obstacles in more than one level, right? It might be the monster and the rival for the lover's affection and the problem with addiction, right? So more basics. And this is from your book, and you're going to be writing about this in your assignment, so make sure that you understand it. Typically, a narrative begins with an initial situation, a setup, plus an inciting incident. An inciting incident is basically an incident that kicks off the plot, right? It's the thing that sets the desire of the protagonist in motion. So, what does, in the most recent thing you watched, what is the incident that changes the character's situation and creates a new situation that has them trying to achieve a goal? That's what you want to look for. And we'll look at an example in a minute. Then there's a series of changes. And then finally, at the end, a new situation arises through character choice and conflict that restores equilibrium to the world of the story and brings about the end of the narrative. So the conflict is resolved in one way or another, right? And that doesn't always mean that it's resolved happily for our main characters. It just means that we understand the outcome if they don't get what they want. But what almost always happens in every good story is that a character changes, right? And I want you to think about this when you write about Lady Bird. How does Lady Bird change from the beginning of the movie to the end? What is her character arc? So, an example from a famous film that we've probably all seen, The Empire Strikes Back, begins with our main character, known as the protagonist, Luke Skywalker, hiding out from the villains, the Empire. Story changes that result from conflict and character choice force him into a climactic showdown with antagonist Darth Vader. So Luke decides he wants to go, he wants to leave the rebellion, he wants to leave his friends so that he can go get his Jedi training from Yoda. But when he realizes his friends are in trouble, he decides he needs to leave again to go help them, even though Yoda says it's a mistake, right? So these are choices that Luke makes. And interestingly enough, for a big Hollywood film, they end up in his defeat. He makes the wrong choices, right? Because Vader wins. The bad guy wins. The conflict is over. The equilibrium was restored, right, to the story. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a happy ending. But, as we talked about, a change does occur in our main character, because even though Luke is defeated, he changes by becoming wiser and more humble, right? He learns to listen more. He learns not to be so impetuous. So how do character traits play into this? Well, the character traits are attitudes, skills, habits, tastes, psychological drives, and other qualities that distinguish a character, right? Our most interesting characters are the ones that where these traits are arranged in very original and compelling ways, right? And traits in opening scenes are relevant to later scenes. So skills they have or attitudes, things that they do, habits are going to pay off in some way. This is one of the ways that story is structured. That when you introduce elements early in the film, they're going to pay off throughout the film and at the end of the film, right? Nothing is random. That's why storytelling is so hard. Because the writer has to connect every little thing to create a satisfying story. So in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke has some traits introduced early and from the first movie, Star Wars. They include his force abilities, his survival skills, his combat adeptness, and his impetuousness. His rashness, his quickness to action without thinking. All of these things that we see in him early pay off late. Okay, so one last slide here. This is also discussed in your reading. It's a little bit more complex of a concept, but we'll work through it. The flow of story information. How is information delivered to you as a viewer or as a reader, right? And one of the main things that a writer or a filmmaker has to decide is, what is the point of view of the character going to be? How much does that character see? And as a result, how much do we see about the story world and things that are happening, right? So information can be very restricted, where we don't know what's happening. And as we learn things, we're surprised because we're learning them along with the character. Or it can be unrestricted, right? Where we see everything and maybe the character doesn't see it, and so we're afraid for what's going to happen. So, for example, if we know there's a bomb in a building and a character walks in there and they don't know, that's unrestricted story information because we have it all, and then that creates suspense. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Is the bomb going to explode, right? And filmmakers usually move between restricted and unrestricted narration to create surprise and suspense, right? Because it's no fun if we don't know anything about what's going on, but it's also no fun if everything's spoiled, like if we can guess everything that's going to happen. So it's a very tricky dance that filmmakers and writers do in terms of revealing and concealing story information to keep us watching. And a really great example, a really expert screenplay, is this movie 10 Cloverfield Lane. Basically, you have these three characters who are end up locked in a bomb shelter because of some cataclysmic events that happens above ground, and they don't really know what happened. And the way that the movie moves between restricted and unrestricted narration and surprise and suspense is expert. And it's one of my favorite movies. So if you're interested in another film in addition to Lady Bird to check out for storytelling this week, you can check out 10 Cloverfield Lane. Okay, so that's the end of Lecture 2. Let's move on, and we will talk about the classical Hollywood cinema.